BFM 89.9. Good morning. I'm Roshan Kanesan and you're listening to Ringgit and Cents, the show that's all about personal finance. Now, the tax season is coming to an end for 2018. If you haven't done it yet, you better hurry. You've got just about a week left. Now, if you're done but feel you could have filed your taxes better, then don't go anywhere because that's exactly what we'll get into in this episode. Now, as usual, you can get in touch with us on Twitter at BFM Radio or on WhatsApp at 017-789-8899. In fact, why don't you let us know how your tax experience was this year? Now, in the studio with me, I have Mr. Thaneermalai, Managing Director of Thannees Tax Consulting Services. Welcome to the show, Thannee.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you very much.
Now, Thannee, you were in a few weeks ago where we talked about the SVDP and Najib's tax bill at that point.
Yes.
Now, I want to take a look at next year's taxes.
Right.
Some of my friends feel they could have done their taxes better this year, but they just didn't know what to do, how to plan better. And I'm hoping you can help me out with this.
Definitely, I think, yeah.
So first things first, Thannee, what are some of the top line steps that we can take over the next year to make sure that we do better in our taxes next year?
Very simple. I think the first thing is, don't forget, as I say, I want to repeat it again, the 2018 return must be filed by the 15th of May, and you have to do it by means of e-filing. That's something you have to do, one. Number two, with regards to the next year, most people only realize at the end of December or sometime when they come in March or sometime in April, they decide they're going to search for these records. They haven't kept the records. That's the most important thing. You got to keep these records. But you first also, what I'd like you to do is during the year, you got to read a little bit about it and understand what are the benefits, what are the items that you can take a benefit from and reduce your taxes. Remember, taxes is it's imposed, man-made. It is not something that is actually coming naturally to you. It is something that the government has created in order to actually fund its own government activities. So in that sense, when it is actually created by, the tax by the government authorities, depends on the policy, you too should take advantage of all the reliefs and all the deductions and all the whatever that you can get. It is not actually, people get mixed up, but they think it's avoidance. It is not avoidance. If you plan your affairs, you are entitled to it. There's no such thing as planning is not allowed. Planning is legitimately allowed.
So can we dive into that a little deeper? What is the technical difference between planning and avoidance?
Avoidance is where you actually go into a scheme or you arrange something intentionally to avoid taxes, intentionally to reduce your taxes. For example, if you're a company, you buy a loss company intentionally to use the losses and nothing else. You've got no commercial reason. Similarly, if you enter into some scheme where someone advises you, you put in the money and then you get a tax deduction without having incurred a cost, but you get a tax benefit. Effectively, you enter something, you do not incur a cost, you don't incur a loss, but you get a tax benefit. That's not acceptable avoidance.
So tax planning is basically optimizing your taxes to pay the least amount of taxes, but everything is legal.
Everything is legal. You're perfectly allowed to do what you have. If you have a choice between making a donation and giving somebody who hasn't got an approval, say, for example, a Section 44(6) approval, you can choose to give that organization through this Section 44(6), and you get a deduction for the donation. Or you can give it as a gift, which you may not get a deduction for it. Whereas, you have a choice. When you have that choice, choose the choice that allows you the tax deduction. That's your choice.
So it's all about being efficient with our taxes.
You must take some little bit of time. It's not too difficult, just a little bit of time. If you just understand the basics, you can actually get it. And the tax authorities in your tax return also, whenever you file, you look at this year's tax return, you can use it for next year. They give you all the reliefs. They give you all the deductions. Just bear in mind and start collecting the bills in order to maximize those, reliefs.
So before we get back to the steps, the tangible steps to prepare for next year, I want to ask you about tax evasion. Is that different from tax avoidance, or is it?
Tax evasion, you intentionally set out actually to evade taxes, like you do not disclose income. That's evasion. For example, you've received rental income, you've received other income, commission income and others. You intentionally hide it. That is evasion, where you have an intent not to pay tax.
And tax evasion is not just for the big companies or the rich people. It applies to everyone who earns an income.
Actually, if you don't declare your rental income and you're receiving it for the last 5 years, that is evasion. That is a simple, clear cut for an individual. For a company, we talk about it in more complex terms. They go through complex schemes to avoid and evade taxes. So avoidance is somewhat regarded as legal, but the spirit of it is you're not following the spirit of the law. You're doing it only for tax purposes, and therefore that is unacceptable avoidance. But there is also acceptable tax avoidance. But people these days don't want to use the word avoidance because there's a misunderstanding of the word and it has a connotation that is bad. But actually legal avoidance is perfectly fine, because you have just chosen, it's what we call in Malaysia mitigation. So don't use the word avoidance, it's actually mitigation. If you are allowed to mitigate your taxes. So if there is a choice, you choose the best way that's most tax efficient.
So now we've discussed three terms here: tax planning, tax avoidance, and tax evasion. Tax evasion, completely illegal.
And it's criminal.
It is criminal.
You can even be charged, taken to court and jailed even. That's fine.
And that's intentional as well.
Intentional. And avoidance is simply there is the acceptable. Now at one time it was entirely legal, completely everything was acceptable, but now there is abusive avoidance and acceptable. We don't want to call it acceptable avoidance, we call it tax mitigation. That's the other word you use, which is acceptable. And the final one is tax planning is perfectly fine. You can go about planning like you repackage your employees' salaries, etc. That's all planning.
All right, and we'll get into the repackaging in a little bit. Now, coming back to the example you pointed out just now about people who've had rental income for the last 5 years but haven't declared any of it. Do they have any solutions
I think you have a solution till September, which I talked about in the last event, because at the moment the tax authorities are very lenient and they're saying use the special SVDP program, come forward, declare the thing, pay us the 10% penalty up to June and then 15% up to September, and we will take it all in good faith. That's it. So that's an opportunity. So even if you have not, it may be today, it may tantamount to evasion, but you can actually bring it in, pay the tax, and the authorities are not going to do anything about it. They want to collect. They want you to become a responsible taxpayer from 2019 onwards or 2018 onwards. That's it.
So if you want to learn more about that, the SVDP, you can catch the full conversation on the BFM app or on Spotify for that matter. Just look up Ringgit and Cents. Now, don't go anywhere. Up next, we're going to talk about the repackaging of your salaries that could potentially be better for your tax planning. This is Ringgit and Cents, the show that's all about personal finance. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying with us here on Ringgit and Cents, the show that's all about personal finance. Today, we're taking a look at taxes. And yes, the tax season is coming to an end, but you can still start preparing for next year. There is a lot of ways you can optimize and, plan better for your taxes. And in the studio with me is Thaneermalai, Managing Director of Thannees Tax Consulting Services. So Thannee, earlier you said that we should look at repackaging our salaries. Could you break that down for us?
Basically, all I'm saying is you're receiving, say, 50,000 ringgits a year, for example, or 100,000 ringgits a year. All you're doing is actually now organizing, instead of receiving all in the form of a salary, which is entirely taxable, and then you claim your personal reliefs, But instead of doing that, you actually break down that package and you say, look here, instead of receiving 100,000, I may receive 80,000 ringgits, but maybe I get an interest subsidy on the housing loan. I take out a housing loan, but up to 300,000 ringgits, they will give you, whatever interest subsidy you get is actually tax exempt. So in that sense, you try repackaging it, and therefore you work with the employer and you say, you give me an interest subsidy. So if you're paying, say 6% or 8% or 5%, then he gives you a 2% subsidy. That's not taxable. That's one of those things. So all I'm saying is you find ways of actually reorganizing your 100,000, you still receive in total, but you receive it in cash and you receive it in maybe benefits in kind and perquisites, so that some of those perquisites and benefits in kind will not be taxable. So instead of getting the 100,000 taxed, you may be only getting the 70,000 taxed, and the 30,000 you get a lower rate of tax because there are different ways of packaging that.
So back to the interest subsidy we were talking about. Now, this is the example here is that you've got a mortgage and you're paying, say, 5% interest.
5%, and the employer decides to subsidize you 2%.
And this comes out of your salary, correct?
Of your salary. So if effectively you reorganize you. I mean, the employer is not going to pay. He effectively, you're saying to him, look here, instead of giving me, you give me an interest subsidy, or you give me a car, or you give me some other benefit, like a telephone. You pay my telephone bills, etc. Or you give me petrol allowance. For example, if you go from home to work, and you can get a 6,000 ringgit petrol allowance, which is not taxable. So if you're receiving 100,000, instead of you receive 94,000 in salary and 6,000 in petrol allowance, a very good example. But when you come to the housing loan, what happens is it should be up to the value only 300,000. So if you take a loan more than 300,000, there'll be a pro-rating. Anything above 300,000, you don't get that tax exemption. Even if there is a subsidy, it's be fully brought to tax. But up to 300,000, if you get an interest subsidy, it's not taxable.
So there are various different allowances that we can package into our salaries. It depends on whether there are exemptions that have been explicitly stated in the laws.
In the law.
So things like transport allowance, petrol allowance. Now that's in there up to 6,000 ringgit a year.
From home to office. I can give you very quickly a few
Yes,
more.
Please.
You get your dental, for example, for your dental, your medical, even medical will cover traditional medicine, but there are funny nuances there. It's funny. The odd thing there is when it comes to medical, you get your modern medicine, you get your acupuncture, traditional medicine, Malay, Chinese, Indian, Ayurvedic. But if you think homeopathy, you don't go and claim for aromatherapy and other things. Don't claim. Don't go overboard and try claiming things, So if you get insurance, if the employer is providing you insurance, group insurance, medical insurance, all that, then if he gives you subsidized, for example, the employer is actually produces products or he's actually in manufacturing and it's a consumable product, then you can receive consumable products, up to a certain limit. And if he is also providing you services, say if I'm a tax consultancy and I'm providing services to my employees free of charge, that's also free. So he can also be receiving. So you can get discounted products up to a certain amount. There is a limit to it. So all those things, if you can actually start receiving that in kind, as a perquisite, because the difference, let me tell you, when I say benefits in kind and perquisites are convertible to cash. Benefits in kind are not convertible. So if you, for example, get a car, then there is a scale rate you get every month. So instead of if you get the full car, it's not the market value of what you're using. It is a specific scale rate, which is a much smaller amount. And so if you start looking at the benefits list, and it's all available in the websites, it's all available, in the income tax returns, and start using it and start talking to your employers. But the employers must be cooperative and proactive with you, which I think many, some employers have, but majority of the employers have not thought about this. This is an area that can be used to motivate employees and to encourage them to work harder for the company, because you're now also saving them taxes.
And this is all tax planning, completely clean and
absolutely legitimate tax planning. No one can deny you the right to use what is already available in the statute books. It's just that most people don't see the full thing, And I think, yes, who can use the tax advice is not every employee. The responsibility to me should be lying with the employer. If he's a responsible employee, he should be thinking of his employees and giving it to them in a more efficient way. All I'm saying is a tax-efficient package. That's all I'm saying.
So, Thannee, can we clarify the difference between a benefit, an allowance, and a perquisite?
No, an allowance would be a cash allowance, so automatically that becomes a perquisite already, an allowance. And if you mention anything, if you give away in cash, the whole amount is taxable. It's not a very efficient way. It's like giving salaries already. It's just when you give it in some other form, then it becomes different. Like a telephone, you give him a use of some other instrument, like a computer face, or if you give him some other, some instruments, that actually is useful to him personally. Then it's fine. Then there's a value attached. It becomes a benefit in kind. And there are table rates, for all sorts of things, If you try giving him a piano, there is $1, $20. There's an organ, $10. Stereo. You can go through. It's all listed here. In fact, it's all listed. If you give an air conditioner, and all these, you got all sorts of amounts here.
When you say listed here, you mean listed on the IRB website?
Website, exactly. And if you don't want to actually take this, if you don't want to take that values, you can always look at the asset. And like I said to you just now, like an organ has a 10-year life. You divide the cost by the 10 years. You take each year into a benefit in kind. So you've got a formula method and you've got a prescribed method. You can also choose whichever you want. So you see what's efficient for you, and you ought to use it. You ought to use it. But I still, reiterate that it's the employee, it'll be difficult for him to look at it. But if an employer wants to help, and more employers should be encouraged to look at the employee's tax planning. And I would certainly say employees will appreciate that very much if you can save them 10 or 15% of their taxes. In fact, your tax bills can go down as much as that.
Now, looking beyond the allowances, are there any other ways we can repackage our salaries to better optimize?
I think another group of people, we are talking about the current employees, there are a number of people actually. There are people who are earning less than the 40-odd thousand ringgits because, practically there's no tax to pay. And those actually, the other group who is actually filing returns and no other income other than employment income, they don't file any other tax returns. They also need to do that group needs to do tax planning. Another group that we haven't talked about that needs to also look at planning is those who are about to retire. That's another group. Mm-hmm. Because if you are in about 50 years and 55 you might retire or 60 you might retire, that is the point at which you got to think about, maybe looking at looking at not so much repackaging, but talking to your employer about giving you a gratuity payment at the time of retirement. Because at the time you retire, and if you've been with the company more than 10 years, etc., you can entirely get that sum of money when you retire tax-free. So maybe if you can get 500,000 or 800,000, it's a lot of money to get at that point in time. And you might actually, it may be seen as, some people will say, look here, this is like avoiding, you're actually repackaging your salary. What you're saying is, for example, you're supposed to get for the next 5 years all the pay increases. You get a much smaller pay increase and you start saying to the employer, like, let's talk about a gratuity. Give it to me in the form of a gratuity. Then you're not exactly reducing your salary purposely to do that. You're just saying to them, look here, can you think about giving me a gratuitous payment? In addition, maybe I take a little less pay increase also. To me, you're not exactly, that's not really evasion or avoidance. You're just talking to the employer and asking him whether he can actually help you. And he may even add on more money to give you because you work loyally for him. That's something very important that many people do not actually appreciate. At the point of actually retirement, you are entitled to a tax-free gratuity payment. And that's very important. But the only two things I will say to this is don't try becoming too clever by actually, getting this gratuity payment or this compensation. And then the very next day, you go back to the same employer with a new employment contract. Now, that is avoidance. You have done this to avoid taxes. You got to, that fine line must be known. Many people, people try to do it is by, they're needed, but they say they have retired entirely. You really should retire. So that's something that's important for that group of people. So these are kind of things that they need to think about. And the repackaging, as I say, there are so many, you got to go through the whole list of the perquisites and you've got to go through the benefits in kind, as I say, and start using it, And I think you can save yourself, you can even cut down your taxes by about 10% without any doubt, And the last thing we never talked about is the reliefs, Many people do not also read these reliefs carefully. For example, you've got your spouse relief, you've got your, lifestyle 2,500, which is for your computers, smartphones, and everything. So there is that. For sports equipment, everything, you got 2,500. If you pay, for example, life assurance, that's another 3,000. Then 4,000 for EPF, and the other thing is don't forget the 6,000 ringgits for SSPN for the children's education. That's another 6,000. So if you start adding this, and if you are in the good years, if you're 30s, 40s, you have a family, take advantage of all this, put this money into the right places.
All right, and on that note, Thannee, do you have any other closing remarks for people who want to plan better for their taxes in 2019?
I would just say at the end of the day, I go back to the basics. Please keep your records. Please look through all the reliefs and don't look at it in the last minute because you cannot spend that money in the last minute. You must spend the money or whatever you need to in order to claim this earlier in the year, and talk to your employers, because the most important part many people are not doing is actually you must talk to your employers and ask the employers whether they will help you look at repackaging and saving you some tax. Even if it is 5,000 or 10,000 ringgit, it is still helpful to you. Why lose it? Because the government is not exactly coming in saying you must pay, you must pay more taxes than you do. They're very, very clear. Pay the right amount of taxes. That's it.
I've been speaking to Thaneermalai, Managing Director of Thannees Tax Consulting Services. Thank you for joining me on the show today. Before we end, I'd like to remind everyone that Roomit Season 2 is out. In fact, the first episode of this new season was about income tax. You can find those episodes on the BFM Facebook page or check out roomit.my. And on that note, thank you for tuning into Ringgit and Cents, the show that's all about personal finance. Up next is the 10 a.m. news bulletin, followed by Enterprise. BFM 89.9.